Good afternoon. We are going to let's call this meeting to order, and John, I will hand it over. We don't need to look. I'm committee meetings. I'm usually not. We don't need to take any attendance or anything, right? So we'll jump right into it.
Yep, and just Jen has a sick child, so she is not able to join today.
Oh, shoot.
With me, of course, is Rusty Merchant, Chris Glass. Gentlemen, you may as well come right up. We're going to get right into the legislative update. Chris was kind enough to walk us through his detailed presentation. Since this is our first meeting since kind of the governor's executive order, or excuse me, executive budget came out, we thought we'd really put emphasis on that. So Chris, why don't you just jump right into it?
Yeah, before I go through details, it might be helpful if Rusty just wants to make a few comments of process, just to make sure everyone's familiar with what we should expect in the coming months as the legislature considers the governor's proposal.
May I ask one question before we get started? What is the West Michigan Triangle's relationship with the Michigan Association School Board Government Relations Committee?
Yeah, so we no longer have the West Michigan Talent Triangle, because
Okay.
enough people asked me to say, what is it? That I thought we should be more explicit about what we're doing. So that's where we rebranded to be the Education Advocates of West Michigan.
Okay.
And I work very closely with both Jen Smith at MASB, and we're in frequent conversation about what bills are out there and what's the best way to pursue policy. And so she provides a lot of perspective from the board members as well as others, and she brings that
I'm just
lens
on
to the
that committee,
discussion.
and I just wondered how we, work together. So that
Yep.
that answers the question.
Yep.
Thank you.
Double mic'd here. To Chris's point, the budget process normally is pretty straightforward. Really, the things that can cause it to speed up or delay are the politics or the amount of dollars that are available. I would say this particular budget cycle, my sense is they're going to want to get through it quicker than they have in the past, partially because they do have so many funds available. But the governor proposes second week of February, and the legislature now moves into subcommittee hearings for the entire budget, including the education budget, which will have us go through the end of March. You may or may not see each chamber pass one of their own sort of versions of those particular budgets, including K-12, and then have conversations up until the end of May through the revenue estimating conference, where they sort of get a number and get targets, and then go in and have the sort of true negotiations in order to get to a final budget. Last year, they didn't finish the budget until just before the budget deadline in October, but they had passed school aid prior to, because there was a lot of pressure from schools and other groups to say, give us something that's predictable, so at least know where we are. The hiccup in all of this will be federal funds, and how do they run those federal funds through a subcommittee process by giving larger targets to those individual subcommittees? Does it remain as it has now, where essentially the two appropriations chairs in the governor's office negotiate these things as they go and as they decide to spend dollars? And I don't think we know the answer to that question. And we've been asking it a lot, including folks who are supposedly going to be in the room, and they're not sure sort of what they're going to do. I think we all have an expectation that there's going to be sort of some end date where they're going to try to have all the money spent by that might be before the feds have required them to spend all that money. And I'm beginning to believe that that's not the case. You're going to see this sort of stretch out over a couple of budget cycles. Sort of morphing over all of that is the fact that you have an independent commission that has drawn completely new lines for state Senate, state House, and Congress, where you have incumbents running against each other for a new seat because they both got drawn in or move in to run against another incumbent. This is happening on both sides of the aisle, and that has created caucus dynamics on both sides of the aisle in both chambers that I think folks are trying to figure out how they're going to navigate and do. I think it all means, from, if I had to put a guess on it, you're going to see the beginning of June, they're going to be done, because they're all going to want to go out and get hitting doors and campaigning. So that was probably longer than you wanted, but that's the sense of where I think go.
Now I get to cover the fun stuff. The one thing I wanted to bring this committee's attention, and you're well aware of, but I do think it sets a backdrop for a lot of what Governor Whitmer put forward in her executive proposal. And you're going to see tenets of her proposal that is working its way into other advocacy circles. And that would be with your traditional school lobbying groups, as well as other stakeholders who rely on a high-quality education system with dedicated professionals to keep our communities moving in the direction we all want and the rest of society moving forward. So the first thing I would bring to your attention is looking at teacher preparation enrollment. When I first came into this role in 2013, the conversation was always, yes, we have less teachers, but we have fewer students. So why wouldn't that be the case? And what I wanted to bring to this group's attention is, yes, we do have declining enrollment statewide since that 2009 period, 9%. But you can see with teacher prep enrollment and teacher prep completers, dramatically larger declines than what we have for enrollment. And even if you had a saturation of educators at one point, you can only sustain those gaps for so long before you get to the position we're at today. When we look at it in total, I like to use 2006 as the benchmark year. That's when Mr. Glass met Mrs. Glass, who was a first grade teacher. She had a lot at Michigan State University coming out of, she had a lot more competition for a lot fewer jobs at that point in time. And so 8,136 people completed a program in the state of Michigan at that point in time. Now we're at 2,370. So a very stark decline. And when we look at that, Michigan has the largest decline in the entire nation from that same period of time of individuals who are completing teacher preparation programs. So Houston, we've had a problem. We still have a problem. When we look at employment for Michigan's K-12 system, you can see even during the pandemic, we have received surplus of funds, yet we see each quarter declines in employment within the education workforce. So that is another telling story of something that's suggesting that the environment we're in is making it difficult to attract and retain individuals despite having an influx of resources to be able to support them. So let's take a look at Governor Whitmer's budget proposal. First thing I want to draw your attention to is an interesting chart here. And on the far left, you can see in January of 2020, when COVID was just an international headline, Governor Whitmer was getting ready to release her second budget proposal. There was excitement about a $300 per pupil increase. We were moving along. And then by March of 2020, we know what happened at that point in time. And what this was, and what this shows, is that back in January of 2020, when we thought we'd have $25.5 billion as a state between the school aid fund and the general fund, pre-pandemic, that's what the governor built her proposal on. You can see as May came, there was significant revisions downward. People were concerned about what kind of impact the pandemic would have on the economy. Would the federal government step up, provide assistance? All of those sorts of questions. Throughout August, January, and into May of 21, the federal government did provide sizable relief to states and units of government. And then we got to the point where actually, where we came in for the fiscal year 20 was the state had $29 billion between the school aid fund and the general fund. So over that period of time, throughout a pandemic, and for good reason, because we have to respond to the needs of our citizens, we actually have more money than we thought even prior to the pandemic to be able to work for this budget. So the governor really puts it into three buckets. The first bucket, historic and equitable funding, which remains a priority of ours in this body when it comes to advocacy. Talent in schools is the second bucket, and then mental health and safe schools is that third bucket. The per pupil funding, the governor's recommending a 5% increase. We're now at the point between this current school year and what she's recommending for next year, where all schools receive the same amount per pupil. And so she's advocated for a $435 per pupil increase. It'll be interesting to see how the legislature reacts to that number and whether or not they move upward. And it remains to be seen. It's too early in the conversations, the discussions to really have a feel for that. Typically, we don't have a feel for that until the May consensus revenue estimating conference comes, and then we have a feeling of whether or not there's additional resources out there.
May I ask a question, please?
Absolutely.
Now, when you say increased base per pupil funding, so everybody is going to get the $9,135, but our schools with high income, special ed, English learners, are there monies for those schools?
Absolutely. Yes. And this slide here gives you a little bit more context. And the governor continues to make progress, and just the legislature deserves credit.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt for a second. So just to kind of build on what the last year's school aid budget was another historic increase. And for the first time since Proposal A, we had parity between the highest funded and lowest funded base per pupil foundation. So we are now all starting at that base per pupil.
Okay, so that's where we start. And, okay, that's fine.
What we've said all along is priority one is let's get to parity. Now let's build and invest for equity, which is what you're about to see.
Okay, good.
And just to provide additional context to John's comment, our state has never provided at a baseline equal funding. I mean, that was the goal of Proposal A, and it took almost 30 years to get to the point where we actually achieved that. So to the governor's credit and the legislature's credit, over the last few budget cycles, they have made progress on a student-centered funding formula that recognizes the fact that not all children are the same. And one term that I've heard from John consistently is we don't have one-size-fits-all approaches when it comes to the education of our children. And so the governor recommends a $222 million increase for at-risk. For the first time, that categorical would be fully funded per the state's definition. And I want to take a second here because this is something that's an important nuance. The research says, and what we are advocating for, is that every at-risk child receives 35% of that base amount we just talked about a slide ago. The state has always said it's their goal to get to 11.5%. This would be the first time they actually get to 11.5%. So you may hear them say fully funded. It doesn't mean it's 35% like the research says. It means it's 11.5%. So progress, absolutely. Where we need to be, not yet. Special education.
11.5% increase per pupil that fits that designation to the district.
Correct. Yep. Special education, continued progress on that. As a state, we have a shortfall of over $700 million to where districts have to utilize other funding streams in order to offset mandated special ed costs. And so there's a continued investment of $150 million. We've had investments the last 3 years in special education, which has helped relieve some of that burden, and this proposal takes an additional step. Small investments within CTE, English language learners, as well as some other line items there. But in general, they're trying to sustain this notion of a 5% increase.
Put that back 1 second, please. Oh, wait.
Well,
this
you're
is it,
looking at
this
that
is it.
too. I'm just going to add, again, the Michigan School Finance Research Collaborative, which kind of did the 0.3, 0.4 multipliers. If we're going to get more of equity in meeting the true needs and costs of educating all of our scholars. In this proposal, it's historic and is a huge step in the right direction. It's still far below. I mean, you mentioned the 11.5% when it really should be more like 35%. Special ed or English learners is in a very similar category. So from an advocacy standpoint, we certainly would like to see more in each of those. But of all of these, the English language learners is far lower than the others.
Yeah.
Still 5%, historic increase, but not to meet the true costs of meeting the needs of our English learners.
Well, and to give some context to that, with the ELL students, this categorical really came to be 3 years ago, right? As a state, we were not providing additional financial support for English language learners. We relied only on federal funds, which does not come near providing the support that the cost to be able to meet the needs of those students. So there's room to grow there, and it's in its infancy. And I guess beyond the advocacy, it's at least we're at a place where there's recognition that these different buckets need to have resources in them to adequately meet the needs of students. Talent in schools, a second bucket I mentioned within the governor's proposal. This is going to get by far the most attention, right? We've talked about 5% increase, which is certainly welcomed. But that is already following a path that the legislature has agreed to the last few budget cycles, the governor has put forward. Now we're into the point where we're really talking about some sizable investments in an area the state hasn't got into. And that gets into direct bonuses to our education workforce. The governor is advocating for $1.5 billion. Her proposal is for 4 years. And so for the first 2 years, everybody who's affiliated with a school and working in a school will receive $2,000. In year 3 and 4, it would be for teachers only and for those certified professionals, which means your counselors, your school social workers, psychologists. The legislature will be taking a look at that because that is a sizable investment. The governor is also recommending investments in teacher onboarding, induction, and mentoring. This gets at the retention aspect of the education workforce. There's some grants available for regional partnerships for ISDs, school districts, and other external stakeholders to work together to grow our workforce, which remains out there. And then the governor is also calling for resources to go towards scholarships for first-time degree seekers and career changers who want to get into education. And so that $250 million investment would cover potentially 12,500 new educators. If we back up to that first slide, we now know we're at a point where we have roughly 2,600 completers each and every year, right? So you can see that's roughly a 5-year investment that the governor's talking about for those scholarship opportunities. Student teachers, for the first time, our state would be paying student teachers to obtain that experience, and they're talking about a $9,600 per semester stipend that individuals would receive. Right now, that's largely an unpaid experience, and then the individuals have to shoulder the burden of second jobs and or taking out additional loans, which incurs higher costs for them to pay off in future years. And lastly, the big one there, and then happy to go deeper, is grow your own programs. How do we scale up our current workforce? And so there's opportunities for paraprofessionals, aides to become certified teachers, or opportunities for other folks to become those initial certified staff and work through the program. Ms. Grant?
And we may not know this, but do we know as far as the student teaching stipend, is that common in other states? Is that just a very Michigan thing, or is that kind of across the board? Students aren't paid to do that role.
Other districts across the nation are starting to look at that, specifically in, I think, Massachusetts, I heard recently. And there's other districts doing.
But it's common right now that it's an unpaid position.
It's an unpaid,
Okay.
yes.
Well, there are programs that, at least at Michigan State, there used to be this 5-year program. I don't know if they still have it or not, but the 5th year, you were student teaching, but you did get a stipend during that 5th year. So, I mean, there is a precedent for doing that for student teachers, but they had already finished 4 years of
4
college.
years,
Yeah.
okay.
So we are in active conversation and have been for over a year with MSU about developing a pipeline program that, among other things, would have upwards of a $10,000 stipend available for 15 student teachers. It's more like an apprenticeship program.
Great.
And I think programs like that, even if they get brought in other states, you're then competing against the market for more people to get into teaching, as opposed to trying to get more teachers to come to Michigan, right? So I think that's what that sort of plays into, especially the scholarship relief and that stuff. I will tell you from other areas where I've been involved in, like home care and others where they've given that $2 increase, there becomes a problem when it stops, because it's been sort of built into family budgets and other things. So there is a pressure that comes on districts and other things. So, I mean, obviously there's a big investment there, but that is something that, you know, sort of folks have to think about between doing that kind of stuff and then trying to get more people into the marketplace to actually be teachers. So just for what it's worth.
So you're talking about the stipend for the stipend? Is that what you're?
Well, so you've got bonuses,
Yeah.
which go on for 4 years for some, and that can sort of that just gets built into your budget, right? We're all human, and I had the dollars, and now I want to keep the dollars. And so that, as opposed to sort of getting more people to go into teaching.
Yeah, I get that, because even if we could pay more, eventually that $4,000 won't be there, what they get, so we can't. So we could even, I mean, it just seems like regardless of what we invest, that investment is going to disappear. So I do worry a little bit about that. Paying off student loans, though, that is huge, because that goes away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, it's
But I
where in
don't-
the pipeline you inject.
Exactly. But I don't want to discourage the governor from giving teachers money.
The other point to emphasize, the governor's structure with this program here regarding the retention bonuses, it's to not intentionally create churn. And so if you stay with the same district or you move to a Title I or a school with higher at risk, you're eligible for it. But if you just transition to another district for the sake of transition, you would not be eligible for those additional funds.
Which is huge, because everybody's complaining that it's the musical chairs.
Right,
So,
right.
We're now in the third bucket, student mental health. And really, it wasn't until 4 years ago the state began to recognize the fact that we have significant mental health needs that are going unmet in our student population. That's when they started a categorical called Section 31N, and it was a mere $15 million investment. And so it was a drop in the bucket. So today, to be at a point where there's $361 million of an increase the governor is proposing is really significant. And now we're at the point where there's over $650 million as a state, if this proposal were enacted, that would be dedicated to meeting the mental health needs of students. There's some great things in this program, but universally, when you talk to people in the field, we're facing the same issue as everywhere else. There are not enough certified professionals to fill the need that's there for the resources we have. And so while it is great, we continue to make investments in this space, if you do not have the individuals to actually hire, we have an issue. And so we're actually calling for an expansion of attraction and retention efforts to include getting more individuals into these programs to where they become school counselors, social workers, psychologists, et cetera, et cetera.
So for this example, even if there were people to hire, what would this kind of proposal mean for Grand Rapids Public Schools? I mean, just because it looks big, but does that mean that we get, 2 more staff, 5 more staff, school nurse? Is there any?
Yeah, so if you look at the school-based mental health professionals, where there's an increase of $120 million, this builds on a $240 million investment that was last year. And it's intended to, in a scaffolding way, cover the partial cost for a 3-year period. Full cost first year, and then it scales down year 2, year 3. So she'd be adding to that investment. When you get into 31N, which is the strengthened school-based mental and physical health, that's in relation to those professionals, and we actually get Medicaid drawdown dollars because it's billable services that GRPS and other districts are providing. And so, if the people are there, additional support in that way. I believe you have school-based mental health clinics as well, and so there'd be access there. She's calling for new school-based health clinics, which could include additional sites within GRPS or additional revenue within the current sites as well. So those are just a few. All right, moving quickly. The budget questions that are out there. Will the legislature support retention bonuses for teachers? Obviously, it is, like you said, Dr. Baker, right? Nobody's going to oppose giving money to educators, but the governor did talk about a sizable amount, and she talked about a 4-year program. May the legislature scale that down a bit and consider 1 or 2 years, and then evaluate its effectiveness and determine in future years if it wants to sustain that. That will be an area they look at.
Excuse me, now, when you talk about retention, and we sort of talked about this at that meeting with the MESB, when you talk about retention, are you also talking about teachers who've been here for 10 years or 15 years? Okay.
They're all included. Yep, absolutely. The second part with the mental health support, what direction may that go in terms of making sure we have enough credentialed individuals to do the work? One of the things the governor's proposal was relatively silent on. She simply kept pace with the investments the retirement system needs to get to that 2038 payoff date that we've been talking about. But we know there are other members of the legislature who want to use these resources to pay down debt and try to accelerate and get that payoff date earlier. That's a question. What are they looking at? How much may they invest? The question on will there be additional seat time flexibility? We'll have to see where it goes, but the governor's proposal is silent on it. The debate in the legislature thus far signifies we're going to be in the same traditional seated environment that we're currently operating in this year. So I don't anticipate there to be much room for negotiations on more flexibility of seat time. So those are some questions they'll wrestle with, and we'll learn more
So
about.
does that mean then, if we use up our days in terms of snow days or health days or whatever, COVID days, then at the end of the year, they expect us to make up those that go over the, what is it, 9 days?
6 and 3, yep. So you can petition for an additional 3 from the state superintendent, yep.
But after that, we'd start making them up after the 9?
Yes.
We're at day 6 or 5?
We're at 6.
Oh, so, really? Okay.
And 2 of those were just because you didn't make the count.
2 was because we didn't hit the 75%. So we had school, we just didn't hit the 75% average daily attendance. And as you might recall, that is an area we think there's some glimmer of hope. And I guess Rusty and Chris can probably touch on that. Right now, we're focused on budget, but I know part of the legislative update will be kind of what's the latest and greatest.
The last thing to bring to your attention is our advocacy at the federal level of trying to get extensions on how long districts have to spend their ESSER funds. So we're asking our congressional delegation right now for the latest round of ESSER funds that was allocated, ESSER 3. Districts have until 2024 to spend those funds. We're asking that they extend that to 2026. This would give more flexibility for investments in programs. But beyond that, we know a number of districts are utilizing it to enhance and upgrade facilities. And with the construction industry where it's at and the supply chain where it's at, they're not able to get those projects done within the scope of what the federal grant allows for. So we're asking for some flexibility on that end. We've gotten a pretty good response from our delegation as individuals saying this makes sense. They're getting other areas industries that have received relief dollars who are asking for the same flexibility. It all comes down to just Congress actually passing a budget and making the change, which it's not common practice for them to actually get a budget done. And so that's the little challenge that we're working through, but we're hopeful with this request. That's what I have, and happy to take questions and turn it over to Rusty and John.
John, I think I misunderstood when you were talking to Dr. Roby. How many days have we used? 5 so
We've
far?
used 6.
Oh, we've used 6.
But of those 6, 2 were days where we
75.
actually were in person. We had school. We just didn't hit the 75% average daily attendance. Therefore, we could either be docked our state school aid fund for those 2 days or we use them as a snow day. As of right now, we're planning to use them as a snow day. The state superintendent has said he will grant up to 3 additional days. So we have 3 more days before this becomes something where we are pressed for legislative relief. And that's a good transition. Mr. Merchant,
Yeah.
do you have an update on?
Yeah, there are, it's not our situation, but there are many districts in the north where they're already north of their 9 days, as you can imagine. So if we end up going above, we will not be alone. The thing that John talked about was we've heard some openness that, for example, if let's say we got to 11 days and 2 of our days were where we had school but didn't reach the 75% threshold, that there would be a willingness to do something legislatively to put us back to 9 by saying we were in school that day, we just didn't meet the 75% threshold. That's where we think the sweet spot might be, and it may be moot for us, but I think there are a number of other districts, particularly in the north, and that always happens. There are always more snow days in the north than there are here.
And
So that-
predominantly Republican seats.
Yeah.
So this is something that there will be some political pressure. There was precedent set during Snowmageddon a few years ago where the legislature did approve additional days. So at least there is some degree of precedent.
Yeah.
The makeup of the legislature was very similar then. So but right now we're at least holding out of the glimmer of the 75% average daily attendance hope.
I always refer to it as Snowtorious BIG, but so we can all have different names
I
for
have
it.
one question then. So you're saying that when we get to the end of the year, we can petition the Department of Ed, and they may give us what we need, but there's no real hope that they will accept the 75% attendance across the board?
Yeah, I think we'll know before the end of the year. The last time we did this, we were in that April and May timeframe. We were really hitting it hard because I think we were at 13 days, if my memory serves me right. What we're saying is, superintendent's already said he's given you the 3, so you got 9.
Okay.
And if we need to go in and advocate for more, i.e. give us the couple of days that we tried to have school but didn't, that would be our position. Other districts are already advocating to give relief because they're at 11 right now.
And the distinction is the state superintendent has jurisdiction on the additional 3. He does not have any jurisdiction on the 75% to
Right.
take legislative action.
That's right.
Yep.
But that doesn't seem to be too acceptable right now, or we just need to push it?
I think there are a lot of folks who are saying, come back to us when we know how many days you have.
Let's wait till winter's over with.
All right,
Yeah.
okay.
And once we are pretty confident winter's over with, let's add up what days you're at, and then we'll take a look at it. That's
Right, yeah,
pretty fair to
and,
say.
yeah, and I think it's fair to say that among some, there is hostility to giving more flexibility from that 75%.
Why is that?
There's some folks who were upset that folks were not in school, that districts were not forcing kids to be in school sooner. And they felt like because there was the flexibility there, that's why schools didn't have kids in person. Now, there are some districts that went virtually for quite a bit of time in the beginning of the school year that are multiples of days over the limit, multiples of days.
And
Well,
that's
the
that's
resistance.
another dynamic that I would just note is that this year's virtual learning is different than what was permissible under executive order. We had a lot more flexibility. Now you've got to meet those 6 hours, and you have pupil accounting that's the same virtually as it is in person. It's a heck of a lot harder to account for. And so those districts that may have had to flip a few times, they may be in even deeper because their pupil account, when they're audited for pupil accounting, if they can't demonstrate that their accounting was aligned with exactly what would be expected in an in-person, they can get dinged for that too. So the problem is actually, it's got multiple layers to
Right.
it.
Now, the schools here in Grand Rapids that did not meet their 75%, or that, we received notes that different buildings had to close because of the virus or other things. Now, were those buildings required to do the 6-hour day and have the teachers there for 6 hours?
The way we implement it, yes, absolutely. And I just want to emphasize that it's a district-wide average daily attendance, so it's
Okay.
not based on
Not buildings.
individual
Okay,
schools.
okay, all right. That's what,
So we have a little bit of padding built in depending on what that day looked like. But yeah, no, we are implementing a pupil accounting that accounts as if we are taking attendance every hour upon the hour and making sure students are putting in the expected hours during the day.
okay.
I'll just add in a couple of quick things. One, the legislature does seem to be keyed in on a couple of things they think they can do immediately on the teacher shortage and part of the challenges that come there. There is a piece of legislation out there that would allow for a retiree to come back without sooner in order to be able to teach, the Zorn bill. And do I have that right? Yeah, and the Zorn bill. And then there's another bill coming through the House that would allow student teachers to be able to be paid and be on their own in the classroom under a sort of a hybrid approach where they could get some dollars, but they could teach in the classroom. So the legislature, I think, is trying to figure out what they can do immediately, but they've not sort of tackled the big push of what the governor is doing in terms of direct dollars for those teachers. But I think they're on board with trying to get there. The other thing that I think we're going to see here pretty quick coming out of the Senate is some bills around dyslexia and the screening that happens with dyslexia. There's some challenges, I think, from the school community and the people who are pushing some of these changes. But I think in the next few weeks, we may see more on that. We did run the bills through our folks who work in that area here, and they had some concerns with it.
Yep.
And so we're looking for new drafts, but you may hear more about dyslexia and the screening that happens and the interventions that happen. I think there's a really big debate on identifying characteristics of dyslexia and diagnosing dyslexia. That seems to be where the big hiccup comes in. People who aren't medical professionals are hesitant to diagnose. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up was we wanted to look for a date to do our Capital Day. where we have our folks come into Lansing. You guys have always been good about sending 2 or 3 or 4 members to do a Lansing Day. We would want to do that again. I would ask you to consider April 12th or 26th. In order to be able to do that, I feel like the timing is good. We'll know more about where the situations are so that we can target and hone our agenda into the most impactful day to make, to make our pitch. So we'll know by then what our school days are, our snow days are,
Yep.
You said the
12th or the 26th, pending another spike in COVID, which doesn't appear to be the case, but good
And knowing
gosh, who
that
knows?
again, there's kind of that, post-spring break, if you want to err on the side of caution, probably go the latter. I
Yeah.
mean, you're a good week almost, but it's still, that following week would be a little bit more padding between spring break.
That 26th day.
Yep.
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 And I think our timing is fine with that. And we would do sort of the program that we've done before. We get to legislators that aren't normally the ones in our area who are in leadership spots throughout the day, and then have a lunch with our Kent folks in our loft, lunch provided, during the lunch hour. So
So you're thinking the 26th might be a better day?
That's what I was advocating, just in the light of any potential post-spring break surge, which we had last year. Not sure it's as relevant this year because of just the changing dynamics, but we can go either way. But if you wanted to give an extra, window of safety, that would be going to the latter one would make sense. But we're good either way, certainly on our side.
yeah, and I would only throw out, I've not talked to John about this, so kick me under the table. But if we could bring one of our two student scholars with us to Capitol Day, that'd be awesome. Not that you guys don't do a great job, but I just think hearing from the kids had an impact on
We
folks.
didn't even talk, and that was what I was going to talk about on
Yeah.
agenda item 2.
So that's the
Talk about
problem
the
with bringing,
legislative
it's
lunch.
just like the outfielder that gets injured, they bring in the rookie and we don't get a job.
It just proves that John and I have known each other I've known John longer than my first marriage, but I'm just saying.
I've known him longer than my one and only marriage.
Oh, sure, yeah, there you go.
But to that point, and that's maybe a good transition just to talk a little bit about our legislative lunch. That was about as great of a success as I think it could have been. The student scholars were the hit of the show. Not just the 2 board reps, but even as the other two,
it was great.
as the other scholars felt comfortable to kind of speak up, it really enhanced it. Had several people come up after and said, I've go to a lot of these legislative lunches, and this is one of, if not the best I've been to. So I think, I'd love to hear feedback from board members if there's anything you would have done differently as we think to the future.
No, I really enjoyed being able to sit with the kids and talk to the kids. And the guy who came and sat with us kind of left after a while. Postumus?
Oh,
Brian.
Brian.
Yeah, he
Yep.
sat with us for a little while, and the student and I were chatting, and we kind of got bored, I guess, and just left us at the table, but that was okay. I was having a fine time with the young lady, so.
I think it seemed like it had an impact. I mean, in
Yes.
terms of we can always find students that, this was a unique kind of scenario where the kind of misery in the buildings needs to be heard because it's something that, so I think that having true representative people and not just students who are trying to make an issue, and I think that the model too, that's a great model for the students, the whole year program. So anyway, yeah, definitely.
I heard from a couple folks who were pleased at the willingness to allow the students to be transparent about what was going on, and that it wasn't a fault of adults necessarily that had failed the kids. It was a failure of a system
Yeah.
Exactly.
to have adequate people to be able to do it, and what needed to happen. And you're always in a danger when you allow kids to speak, because danger's not the right word, because they are going to be.
Right, but
It
they
applies to adults too.
They understood it as a
That's why I do
system.
talking points.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
They understood it in a system perspective and not my principal sucks.
Right.
Perspective,
But also where they had stepped up even on their own to try to be helpful. I thought that was
Yeah.
powerful too.
Yeah,
Well-
no, I thought it was great. We've talked about how great we thought it was. My question is about follow-up. What type of follow-up do we do from those events?
So we have in this case, what, follow up with the students or follow up with the lawmakers?
With the legislators, because I'm sure we probably already have, but if not, it would be great with just a note, nothing like pitching or selling, but a note from students, like, thank you for attending our
Ooh, I like that.
legislative luncheon.
Too.
Or I think
So
we
in
have to
that-
reach out to the kids as well, because, some of them really took a risk and stuck their neck out, I think, that they were, the little girl I was sitting with finally got up and said something towards the end because she was scared to death. She was scared, and I kept saying,
That's
"No,
a good
you can
point.
say it,
And
you
I
can
think
say it."
because our student reps see us all the time, but the other students didn't get to hear how proud we were, as a
Yeah.
full board. So it'd be great to reach out to them as
So
well.
I was planning on, the next, I don't have the date right in front of me here, but my plan was to go back to the Scholars Advisory Council at their next meeting here and do a debrief. What'd you think? What'd you learn? What would you do differently? How can we?
I'd be happy to join that if
Okay.
you'd
Okay.
like me to, just to give them perspective too.
So all those kids that were there are on that committee?
Yes, yes. And then to that kind of similar point, obviously we'll need to land on, did either of those dates work for you three for the Capitol Day?
For now.
12th would be better, but I could make the 26th
Okay.
work.
Okay, well, I think we can make them either work, but if that's better for you, then it's just a matter, I love the idea, that was what I was gonna suggest too, is like, we should bring one or both of them if we can peel them out of school at that time.
Yeah.
And I think any of the students, of course, we love our board reps, but any of the students from that council.
I'm terrible with names, but the young lady that I was sitting with, I asked her what she planned to do. She's at City right now. She wants to be a mortician. And she says, I can't,
Yeah.
I can't take, they don't have the classes that she wants, and I just thought that was at
A very
City High,
lucrative
of all
field,
places, Uh-huh.
Yeah, too bad.
Especially over the last 2 years. Yeah.
It is recession-proof.
It is, there's no
It's
question.
actually, a little more lucrative in a recession, so.
Well, she wanted to be a doctor or a nurse, she loved physiology and this kind of stuff, and, I don't know, there's some relative or something, but.
It's usually what happens. There's usually a relative
City High not really
involved.
offering those kinds of classes. Might have been better off in a more traditional place where we could take physiology or something like that.
It's not for my heart.
I would go and let her take care of me, because she was a sweetheart. I'll put that down
Let's
in my will.
let's hope it's
If I
let's
remember
not
her name.
let's not jump the gun.
All right. Do we have any other questions or comments for any of those items that we addressed on the agenda?
No?
All right. Well, I believe that this meeting is adjourned.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.